The Galactic Crisis. Admiral Ilara Voss strode into the grand chamber of the Galactic Council, her uniform crisp and her expression stern. The murmuring of the assembled alien delegates quieted as she took her place at the circular table. High Counselor Xyloth, a tall, slender being with iridescent skin, stood to address the gathering. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, his melodic voice tinged with gravity. "As you know, the Kryn have been expanding their territory at an alarming rate. Their conquest has left a trail of destroyed worlds and subjugated peoples in its wake." A holographic map of the galaxy shimmered to life above the table, angry red dots denoting the Kryn's advance. Ilara's eyes narrowed as she studied the map. The Kryn were moving with terrifying efficiency, their path cutting a swath towards the heart of Council space. "Our combined forces have proven insufficient to halt their progress," Xyloth continued. "At this rate, key Council worlds will fall within a matter of months." The map zoomed in on a cluster of blue points representing said worlds, the red tide of the Kryn ominously close. "What do you propose, Counselor?" a gruff voice asked. It belonged to Commander Thrax, a hulking reptilian warrior. "We've thrown everything we have at them." Xyloth's luminescent eyes fixed on Ilara. "Not everything," he said softly. "There is one weapon that could turn the tide. A weapon of immense power, created by human hands long ago." Ilara felt a chill run down her spine as realization dawned. "No," she breathed. "You can't possibly mean." "The Dreadnought fleet," Xyloth confirmed, his words sending a shockwave through the chamber. "The most formidable warships ever constructed, capable of reducing entire planets to rubble." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices, shock and disbelief evident on every alien face. Ilara's mind raced. The Dreadnoughts were a thing of legend, whispered about in the darkest corners of human history. They couldn't possibly still exist, could they? Silence. Xyloth's voice cut through the clamor. "I know this comes as a shock, but the Dreadnoughts may be our only hope." He turned to Ilara, his expression imploring. "Admiral Voss, I beg of you, on behalf of the Galactic Council, I ask that you bring this request to your government. Urge them to reactivate the Dreadnought fleet to aid us in our hour of need." Ilara stood, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision before her. "I will relay your request, High Counselor," she said formally. "But I can make no promises. The Dreadnoughts are a dark chapter in human history, one we thought long closed." As the meeting adjourned and the delegates filed out, talking in urgent whispers, Ilara remained standing at the table, staring at the holographic map. The fate of the galaxy, it seemed, now rested on the shoulders of her species and on the terrible power they had once wielded. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. She had a long journey ahead of her, and an even longer conversation awaiting her on Earth. The ghosts of humanity's past were stirring, and it would fall to her to convince her people to confront them head-on. For the sake of all the stars. Humanity's dark past. The shuttle ride back to Earth was a blur for Ilara, her mind spinning with the revelations of the council meeting. As soon as she landed, she requested an urgent audience with President Sarai Nair, the leader of the United Earth government. President Nair greeted Ilara in her office, her warm brown eyes filled with concern. "Admiral Voss," she said, gesturing for Ilara to take a seat. "Your message said it was urgent. What's happened?" Ilara took a deep breath. "Madam President, I come bearing a request from the Galactic Council, one that concerns the very survival of the galaxy and the darkest secrets of our past." Nair's brow furrowed. "I'm listening." Ilara recounted the dire situation with the Kryn and Xyloth's shocking proposal. As she spoke, Nair's expression grew more and more troubled. "The Dreadnoughts," Nair murmured when Ilara had finished. "I thought they were just a myth, a story told to frighten children." "As did I," Ilara admitted. "But according to Xyloth, they are very real. And the Council believes they may be the only thing that can stop the Kryn." Nair leaned back in her chair, her gaze distant. The history of the Dreadnoughts is a closely guarded secret, known only to a few at the highest levels of government, she said slowly. But if what Xyloth says is true, perhaps it's time that history was brought to light. She stood and walked to a wall safe, inputting a complex code. From within, she withdrew a data crystal, ancient and worn. This contains the records of the Dreadnought's creation and use, she said, handing it to Ilara. I think it's time you knew the full story. Ilara inserted the crystal into her datapad, and a flurry of images and text filled the screen. She read in growing horror of a time centuries past, when humanity was fractured and at war with itself. Of a crashed alien ship discovered by one of the warring factions, its advanced technology reverse-engineered and weaponized. The Dreadnoughts were the culmination of this arms race. Massive, heavily armed ships that could operate both in atmosphere and the vacuum of space. They were more than just warships. They were symbols of humanity's darkest impulses, of their capacity for destruction. The war had raged across Earth and the fledgling colonies on Mars and the Moon. Cities were reduced to rubble, entire populations wiped out. It seemed humanity was bent on its own annihilation. But then, a miracle, a ceasefire, brokered by a group of nations that had held themselves aloof from the conflict. A chance for peace, for unity. The warring factions, exhausted and blood-soaked, agreed to lay down their arms, to decommission their terrible weapons and begin anew as a united species. The Dreadnoughts, the most fearsome of those weapons, were dismantled and hidden away, their very existence erased from public record. A deal was struck with the newly contacted Galactic Council. In exchange for admission and the promise of peace, humanity would leave its warlike ways in the past. The Dreadnoughts would never again darken the stars. Ilara looked up from the datapad, her face pale. President Nair regarded her somberly. Now you know, she said softly. The Dreadnoughts are a chapter in our history that we had hoped would remain closed. To reactivate them now, it goes against everything we've worked for. But can we afford not to? Ilara asked, her voice barely a whisper. If the council falls to the Kryn, how long before they come for us? Nair closed her eyes, the weight of the decision settling on her shoulders. I don't know, she admitted. But one thing is clear. This is a choice that cannot be made lightly or in isolation. The full government must be convened. The people must have their say. She fixed Ilara with a steady gaze. There will be consequences, Admiral. Consequences that will echo across the galaxy, no matter what we decide. I hope we're ready to face them. Ilara nodded, her resolve hardening. As do I, Madam President. As do I. The plea for help. The great hall of the United Earth Government was filled to capacity, the air buzzing with tension. Representatives from every nation and colony were present, their faces reflecting the gravity of the moment. At the podium, President Nair called the assembly to order. We are here today, she began, her voice ringing out clear and strong, to discuss a matter of the utmost importance, a matter that concerns not just the fate of our species, but the fate of the entire galaxy. She proceeded to lay out the situation. The Kryn's relentless advance, the Council's desperate plea, and the dark history of the Dreadnoughts. As she spoke, a hush fell over the room, the representatives hanging on every word. When she had finished, a moment of stunned silence followed. Then a lone figure stood. It was Representative Hassan Khan, a respected elder statesman. Madam President, he said, his voice heavy with emotion, what you are proposing, it goes against every principle we've upheld since the unification. The Dreadnoughts are a symbol of our darkest days, of the very worst of humanity. To bring them back, it would be to betray everything we stand for. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, but then another voice rang out. And what do we stand for? It was Senator Lena Ivanova, her eyes blazing with passion. Peace, yes. Unity, absolutely. But also compassion. Also a commitment to doing what is right, no matter the cost. She gestured to the great windows that lined the hall, beyond which the stars glimmered. Out there, trillions of lives hang in the balance. Trillions of souls who look to us, to humanity, for hope, for salvation. Can we truly turn our backs on them in their hour of need? The hall erupted into a cacophony of voices, representatives arguing back and forth. President Nair called for order, but the debate only grew more heated. Amidst the chaos, Ilara sat silently, her heart heavy. She understood the arguments on both sides. The dreadnoughts represented a terrible chapter in human history, one that they had worked hard to move beyond. To reactivate them, even in defense of the Council, risked undoing centuries of progress. But the alternative, to stand by and do nothing while the Kryn slaughtered their way across the galaxy, was that not also a betrayal of their principles, a betrayal of the very idea of humanity? As if sensing her thoughts, High Counselor Xyloth, who had been granted special permission to attend the assembly, leaned over to her. "Admiral Voss," he said softly, "I cannot begin to imagine the weight of this decision on you and your people. But I beg of you, do not underestimate the threat we face." He produced a small holoprojector and activated it. Images sprung to life. Planets reduced to rubble, populations herded into slave camps, once proud species reduced to broken remnants. Ilara felt bile rise in her throat at the sheer scale of the destruction. "This is the reality of the Kryn," Xyloth said, his voice heavy with grief. "They will not stop. They will not show mercy. Not until every last world bows to their rule, or burns." He looked at Ilara, his eyes pleading. "I know what we ask of you is no small thing. But the dreadnoughts, they may be our only hope, the only thing standing between us and total annihilation." Ilara closed her eyes, the weight of the decision bearing down on her. She thought of the principles humanity had fought so hard to uphold, but also of the countless lives at stake, lives that they had the power to save. She stood, drawing the attention of the hall. The representatives fell silent, all eyes turning to her. "I have listened to the arguments on both sides," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "And I believe that both hold truth. The dreadnoughts are a symbol of our past mistakes, of a time when we let our worst impulses guide us. To reactivate them is not a decision to be made lightly." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But we cannot let our fear of the past blind us to the needs of the present. The Kryn are a threat unlike any the galaxy has ever seen. If we do not act, if we do not use every tool at our disposal to stop them, then we are condemning trillions to death or slavery. And that, I believe, would be the greatest betrayal of our principles of all." She looked around the hall, meeting the eyes of each representative in turn. "I propose a compromise. We will reactivate a small number of dreadnoughts, enough to bolster the Council's defenses, but not so many as to threaten the balance of power. They will be crewed by our most trusted officers and operated under the strictest of oversight. And when the crisis is past, they will be decommissioned once more, never to be used again." The hall was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, nods of agreement began to appear. It was a heavy decision, but one that balanced the needs of the moment with the principles they held dear. President Nair gavelled the session to a close. "Then it is decided," she said, her voice solemn. "May history judge us kindly, and may the stars guide us through the dark times ahead." As the representatives filed out, talking in low, urgent tones, Ilara remained seated, her mind racing. The path ahead was clear, but she knew it would not be an easy one. The dreadnoughts would fly again, and the fate of the galaxy would hang on their terrible power once more. The debate on Earth, the decision to reactivate the dreadnoughts, did not come without dissent. As news of the plan spread across Earth and its colonies, protests erupted in cities across the globe. "No more war," they chanted, their signs bearing images of the devastation wrought by the dreadnoughts centuries ago. "Remember the past, don't repeat it." In the halls of government, the debate raged on. "This is madness," argued Representative Singh, his face flushed with anger. "We are gambling with the very soul of humanity. If we unleash the dreadnoughts again, even in the name of defense, we risk becoming the very thing we fought against all those years ago. And what would you have us do? Countered Admiral Ku, a staunch supporter of the plan. Stand by and watch as the Kryn exterminate our allies. Hide behind our principles while the galaxy burns. The dreadnoughts are a weapon, yes, but they are a weapon we can control. A weapon we can use to protect, not to destroy. Back and forth they went, each side passionate in their convictions. Ilara watched the debates with a heavy heart, understanding the fears and hopes on both sides. In the end, it was President Nair who made the final call. "We do not take this decision lightly," she said in a global address, her face grave. "The dreadnoughts are a reminder of a dark time in our history, a time we have worked hard to move beyond. But we cannot ignore the threat the Kryn pose, not just to our allies, but to the very idea of freedom and self-determination in the galaxy." She outlined the plan: a small fleet of dreadnoughts, crewed by the best and brightest of humanity, operating under strict oversight and with the singular goal of defending Council space. "These ships will not be conquerors," she emphasized. "They will be protectors, a shield against the darkness. And when their task is done, they will return to the shadows, never to be used for war again." The reaction was mixed. Some hailed it as a necessary evil, a bold step to protect the galaxy. Others decried it as a betrayal of humanity's principles, a dangerous step back towards their warlike past. But the decision had been made. The dreadnoughts, long dormant, were to be awakened once more. In a secret facility deep beneath the surface of Mars, teams of scientists and engineers worked around the clock to bring the ancient ships back to life. It was a monumental task. The dreadnoughts were a product of a bygone era, their technology almost alien in its complexity. But bit by bit, they came together. Hulls were patched, weapons systems reactivated, engines coaxed back to glowing life, and in the heart of each ship, a new addition, a fail-safe, a way to ensure the dreadnoughts could never again be used for conquest or oppression. Ilara oversaw the work personally, her heart heavy with the weight of responsibility. She knew that every rivet, every circuit, represented a piece of humanity's fate, that the choices they made here, in the bowels of Mars, would echo across the stars. As the last dreadnought was completed, Ilara stood before the assembled crew. "Volunteers all, the best and brightest of Earth's defenders. You carry the hopes of humanity with you," she told them, her voice ringing out in the cavernous hangar. "But more than that, you carry our principles, our belief in peace and freedom, in the right of all sentient beings to determine their own fate." She looked out at the faces before her, seeing in them the same determination, the same resolute courage that had carried humanity through its darkest times. "You are not conquerors," she said, echoing President Nair's words. "You are protectors. You are the shield that will stand between the darkness and the light. And when your task is done, you will return, not as heroes, but as guardians, guardians of the peace we have fought so hard to achieve." With those words ringing in their ears, the crews boarded their ships. The mighty engines roared to life, the dreadnoughts rising from their berths like ancient leviathans awakening from a long slumber. And then they were gone, streaking out into the void, towards the front lines of a war that would determine the fate of the galaxy. On Earth, in the halls of power and in the streets of cities, the debates continued. The questions remained: had they done the right thing? Had they, in trying to protect the galaxy, risked losing their very souls? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain: the dreadnoughts had returned, and the galaxy would tremble before their might once more. The line in the stars. The dreadnoughts dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Council space, their hulls gleaming in the starlight. Ilara, standing on the bridge of the flagship, felt a chill run down her spine at the sight of them. A fleet of ghosts, resurrected from the depths of history. "All ships, report in," she ordered, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. One by one, the dreadnoughts checked in, their captains' voices firm and resolute. They knew the weight of their task, the burden of the trust placed in them. High Counselor Zyloth's image flickered to life on the view screen, his face lined with a mix of relief and apprehension. "Admiral Voss," he greeted, "the Council thanks you for your swift response. Your presence here gives us hope in this dark hour." Ilara nodded, her jaw set. "We stand ready to defend the Council and all free peoples of the galaxy," she said. "But let us hope that the mere presence of the Dreadnoughts will be enough to deter the Kryn." It was a thin hope, and they both knew it. The Kryn were not a species to be cowed by shows of force. They understood only conquest, only domination. And yet, as the Dreadnoughts took up their positions around key Council worlds, a strange calm seemed to settle over the galaxy. The Kryn's advance slowed, then halted, as if they were suddenly uncertain in the face of this new threat. A fragile peace descended, a tense standoff between the might of the Dreadnoughts and the hunger of the Kryn. Diplomats shuttled back and forth, desperate to find a resolution, to avoid the terrible clash that seemed inevitable. Ilara walked the corridors of her ship, feeling the weight of each passing moment. She knew that this peace could not last, that sooner or later something would have to give. It came sooner than anyone expected. The distress call came from a small colony world on the edge of Council space. The Kryn had broken the standoff, launching a lightning raid on the defenseless settlement. Ilara ordered her fleet into action, the Dreadnoughts leaping towards the besieged world with a speed that belied their size. But even as they approached, she knew they would be too late. They arrived to find the colony in ruins, its buildings shattered, its people slaughtered. The Kryn ships hung in orbit, like bloated carrion birds over a corpse. Ilara's heart turned to ice. "This ends now," she whispered. Then, louder, "All ships, engage the enemy. Show no mercy." The Dreadnoughts surged forward, their weapons blazing to life. The Kryn ships, caught off guard by the ferocity of the attack, scattered and fled. But Ilara pursued, her fleet chasing down the stragglers, blasting them into oblivion. The Dreadnoughts, built for war and forged in the fires of humanity's darkest hour, proved more than a match for the Kryn's advanced technology. The battle raged across the system, the wreckage of Kryn ships littering the void. But even as they fled, the Kryn sent out a call for reinforcements, rallying their forces for a counterattack. They came in a wave of steel and fire, a vast armada that seemed to fill the very sky. The Dreadnoughts met them head-on, the ancient human ships and the advanced alien fleet clashing in a titanic struggle for supremacy. It was a battle unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. The Dreadnoughts, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a ferocity that seemed to defy belief. They took blow after punishing blow, their hulls buckling under the onslaught, but still they fought on. Ilara stood on her bridge, her knuckles white on the railing as her ship shuddered and groaned around her. On the view screens, she saw her fellow Dreadnoughts taking hit after hit, saw brave human crews fighting and dying in the cold void of space. But even as the losses mounted, she saw something else. The Kryn ships, for all their advanced technology, beginning to falter. They had never faced an enemy like this, an enemy that refused to yield, refused to break. And break they did. The Kryn lines shattered, their ships fleeing before the relentless advance of the Dreadnoughts. Ilara pressed the advantage, her fleet chasing down the survivors, ensuring that none escaped. When the last Kryn ship had been destroyed or driven into retreat, a cheer went up across the fleet. Against all odds, they had done it. They had held the line. The Kryn's advance had been halted, their seemingly unstoppable march across the galaxy brought to a shuddering halt. But the cost had been high. Of the Dreadnoughts that had set out, only a handful remained, their hulls scared and battered, their crews exhausted and bloodied. They limped back to Council space, heroes of a war they had never sought, but had won nonetheless. In the aftermath, as the galaxy struggled to come to terms with the new balance of power, Ilara stood before the Council once more. The threat of the Kryn has been pushed back, she said, her voice heavy with the weight of what had been lost and what had been saved. But the cost was high, too high. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each counselor in turn. The dreadnoughts have served their purpose. They have bought us the time we needed, paid for with the blood of our bravest and best. But they must not be allowed to become a permanent fixture of galactic politics. That way lies the path to ruin, the very path we sought to avoid. There was a moment of heavy silence. Then, slowly, the counselors began to nod. They understood. The dreadnoughts had been a necessary evil, a terrible weapon wielded in defense of the greater good. But they could not be allowed to become a crutch, a tool for oppression or conquest. And so, in a solemn ceremony broadcast across the galaxy, the remaining dreadnoughts were decommissioned. Their weapons were dismantled, their engines powered down for the last time. They would be preserved, not as instruments of war, but as monuments to the courage and sacrifice of those who had crewed them. As Ilara watched the mighty ships go dark, she felt a sense of both loss and relief. The dreadnoughts had saved the galaxy, but at a terrible price. And now, their work done, they would rest once more. But their legacy would live on, a reminder of the thin line that separated civilization from barbarism, peace from war. A reminder of the eternal vigilance required to walk that line. For in the end, it was not just the dreadnoughts that had held the line against the darkness. It was humanity itself, with its unbreakable spirit, its refusal to bow to tyranny or despair. And as long as that spirit endured, as long as there were those willing to stand and fight for what was right, then there would always be hope, even in the darkest of times.